Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a look at someone the New York Times once described as, well, arguably the most important intellectual alive today. We're talking about Noam Chomsky. His ideas feel more relevant than ever, honestly, for figuring out this complex world we're in.
Absolutely. And Chomsky's work, it's this really fascinating mix, isn't it? Linguistics, philosophy, biology.
Mhm.
But it all kind of comes together around this core idea, this urgent need, as he puts it, to think for ourselves instead of being told what to think.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission here is really to unpack that, to look at his insights on media, on power, and even how our own minds work.
It's amazing, really, to think where it might have started. Our sources point to this one really powerful moment for him. He was just 16, a camp counselor, August 6, 1945. The day the news broke about Hiroshima, he said he was utterly appalled, almost beyond description. But what really struck him was that everyone else just went on to their next activity.
That disconnect.
That profound disconnect, yeah. Seeing something so huge met with indifference, it seems like that really set him on his path.
I think it did. That experience really captures his commitment to critical observation, doesn't it? It's a theme you see running through all his work, whether he's looking at the deep structures of language or the way global power operates. It's about not just accepting things, it's about digging deeper, asking those fundamental questions.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. Before he became this, major public intellectual, he completely changed how we understand language itself. We learn he was proofreading his father's Hebrew grammar book when he was just 10, almost like a genetic fate, as the source puts it. So how did that early knack for questioning things shape his linguistic theories?
Well, his work in linguistics was revolutionary because it flew directly in the face of the dominant theories at the time, behaviorism, specifically B.F. Skinner. Skinner saw language as basically just habit and training, like, conditioning a pigeon, pure stimulus and response.
Right, the pigeons playing ping pong. Skinner famously showed you could get pigeons to peck at bowls, arguing you could make an animal do practically anything I like.
Mm.
But Chomsky looked at that and thought, no, this completely misses what makes humans and human language unique.
Exactly. Chomsky's big idea was that language isn't just learned through conditioning. It's innate, it's organic,
Yeah.
something built into us. He pointed out that kids acquire complex language incredibly quickly without training, just by being around it. It's not rote memorization. His analogy was like knowing that the numbers go on forever. It's an inherent capacity, not something you're explicitly taught rule by rule. And this caused a huge stir, a considerable furor, as the sources say. It really bent the whole curve of linguistic thought.
Wow. So if language is basically hardwired into us, what does that imply about the human mind? This ability we have to create, like an unbounded number of thoughts and express the internal workings of our mind, that really sets us apart, doesn't it?
It really does. And this foundational work, challenging these really widely accepted theories in linguistics, it became a kind of template for him. That instinct to question the dominant narrative, to look beyond the surface assumptions. He applied that same critical approach to power, to media, to everything else. The idea that something deep and important is innate in us, our capacity for language, for thought, means we aren't just blank slates to be conditioned.
Okay, so building on that foundation, that insight into language, Chomsky then turns this critical eye onto the world, particularly the media. How does that connection work?
Well, he strongly believes that a well-functioning media is absolutely crucial for any kind of informed public, for democracy. But he also saw, very early on, how vulnerable it is to bias, to manipulation. And his analyses, which he published decades ago, honestly, they feel even more relevant now with, the internet and social media landscape being so fragmented. He saw the warning signs.
It makes you think, how do you, listening now, decide what media you actually pay attention to? What's worth your time? Interestingly, Chomsky himself, our sources say, his habit is reading the New York Times and the Washington Post every morning.
Yeah, but even with those, the sort of mainstream legacy media, he observed a big shift happening. Less straight news reporting and more columns and opinion. He points out this trend is massively exaggerated in social media and places like Fox News, where sometimes that's all there is. He actually says it takes him much less time to read a major newspaper today than it did 20 or 30 years ago, simply because there's just less there.
And one really damaging effect of that, a lethal effect, as the sources call it, is the disappearance of local media. Papers like the LA Times or the Boston Globe, which used to have their own foreign bureaus, their own investigative teams, they're just shadows now. And that's cheapened the media landscape enormously. Fewer viewpoints, less local accountability.
Exactly. And then you add in the rise of these daily media personalities, people who inject their personal commentary in the name of profit. They often project this false image of perfect insight, like they have all the answers, which makes it incredibly difficult for people who really don't have independent access to information to resist what he calls the media onslaught and figure out what's actually fact.
Which brings us to media literacy. It sounds so crucial. If people were actually taught how to dissect media messages, how to spot bias, it would empower you, wouldn't it? Give you the tools to defend themselves against these tendencies.
Absolutely. And this ties into Chomsky's most, perhaps well-known work on the media, which really started back in the 60s. It culminated in the famous book Manufacturing Consent, which he wrote with Edward S. Herman. It was a groundbreaking argument that, essentially, the public was being manipulated by the media. And these ideas were so radical at the time, they faced suppression. He even faced threats of prosecution.
And that title, Manufacturing Consent, is such a powerful phrase, but it didn't actually come from Chomsky, did it?
No, that's right. It came from Walter Lippmann, who was a major public intellectual back in the early 20th century. The context was World War I. Woodrow Wilson had this problem. A largely pacifist American population. He needed to turn them into raving anti-German fanatics to get support for entering the war. And they did it, largely through something called the Creole Commission, basically a huge government propaganda agency. And Lippmann observed this and, well, he kind of approved of it, in a way. His view was that the public is basically an unruly mob, ignorant, meddlesome. So for society to function for their own good, you have to manufacture the consent. You have to guide them, make sure they stay passive and obedient. He thought the public's role in democracy should be as spectators, not participants. Maybe show up every few years, vote, then go back to their private lives.
Wow, that's quite a view of democracy.
It is.
So Chomsky and Herman took that concept, manufacturing consent, and they systematically analyzed how it happens. They identified these 5 key filters, filters that shape the news we get, often without us even noticing. Let's walk through them. First up, ownership.
Right. The simple fact that most major media outlets are themselves major corporations owned by mega corporations. And that ownership structure clearly have an effect on what they do. Their interests align with other corporations, not necessarily the public. There's a chilling example in the sources. A major corporation literally bought a small publisher just to put it out of business. They destroyed the entire stock of Chomsky's book criticizing U.S. actions in South Vietnam. Talk about cancel culture with a vengeance, as the source puts it.
Unbelievable. Okay, filter number 2. Advertising.
This is about the business model. Historically, media might have been funded more by subscribers. Think about the early U.S. Post Office subsidizing diverse newspapers. But there was a big shift towards an advertising model. Now, the primary market is advertisers. So, in effect, media outlets aren't selling news to you, the reader. They sell the product people to other corporations. You're the product being sold to advertisers.
That completely changes the incentive.
Completely.
Okay, third filter. Sources experts.
This is about where the media gets its information. They tend to be closely tied to government and other established power systems. They rely on official press releases, government spokespeople, approved experts. Think about the lead up to the Second Gulf War, early 2000s. Our sources point out how the media largely fell for it completely. Just repeating the official propaganda about weapons of mass destruction, which led to huge public support in the U.S., even while most of the world was overwhelmingly opposed.
Right, because the official sources were all saying the same thing. Filter number 4, flak.
Flak refers to negative responses, criticism, pressure campaigns directed at media outlets or journalists who step out of line. Basically, critical voices are not welcomed. If you challenge power, you get attacked, maybe lose your job. But supporters of state power, stenographers for power, as Chomsky calls them, they're honored and respected. He points out that those who expose crimes of state are vilified and condemned. It reminds him of Socrates forced to commit suicide for basically corrupting the youth of Athens by asking too many questions. And Chomsky has that famous line, if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like.
Powerful point. And the final filter, number 5, enemy creation.
This is about the need for a common enemy to rally people and distract them. Media helps install national fear by focusing on designated enemies. Historically, it was anarchists, then communists, later terrorists. He gives a really stark example of Cuba. Our sources detail how the U.S. waged a major terrorist war against Cuba for decades and imposes these incredibly harsh third-party sanctions that basically the entire world votes against at the UN every year, except the U.S. and Israel. Yet in the mainstream U.S. media, you can't talk about it. It's effectively erased. It's an astonishing assault, but invisible. And what's really striking is that this analysis, these 5 filters developed back in the 1980s, they still feel astonishingly accurate today, even with the internet.
Okay, so that's the perfect transition. What does this all mean for us now in this hyper-connected digital age? Our sources mention that younger generations might feel they have the world at their fingertips, but often it's a very skewed version. You might think, well, with so many websites and platforms, surely manufacturing consent is harder now. How would Chomsky respond to that?
I think he'd argue that the technology actually amplifies the problems in many ways. Makes them more subtle, maybe, but more pervasive. Take social media algorithms. They're designed to keep you engaged, right? So they push you into these hyper-personalized bubbles, these echo chambers that are arguably deeper than we've ever seen before. So instead of breaking the filters, the tech often reinforces them by feeding you more of what you already agree with.
And those filter bubbles, the sources say, can be particularly troubling for younger users. They can lead to polarizing people, driving people even to more extreme views. Plus, you have the whole issue of surveillance capitalism, our data being constantly collected and used. Chomsky even calls it a soft version of fascism. He points to things like people recording strangers on TikTok without consent becoming normalized. These become soft means of control and domination, which become internalized.
Yeah, he argues users kind of just internalize the idea that I've got to be a slave for most of my life, that constant monitoring, that performance. You don't question it. That's the goal of all power systems.
And related to platform control, there's this phenomenon of algo speak.
Ah, yes, that's fascinating. Where users come up with these secret words or phrases like Panda Express instead of pandemic or leg booty for LGBTQ. They do it specifically to get around strict content moderation by the algorithms on platforms like TikTok.
Chomsky finds it both comical, but also points out it's exactly the kind of tactic power systems use all the time.
Right, like changing the word employers to job creators or employees to associates. It's language used to frame reality. He notes these techniques, this manipulation of language, can be used for domination and control, or they could potentially be used for liberation, depending on who's wielding them.
This all seems connected to a rise in anti-intellectualism, maybe, and this desire or almost expectation for super concise information. Like everything has to be a soundbite. What does Chomsky see as the harm in that, in just getting these short-form takes on complex issues?
His big concern is that it means you don't understand anything. You learn slogans. He stresses that real-world issues are never simple. They're always embedded in incredibly complex, multi-layered situations. You can't grasp that from a TikTok video or a tweet. It narrows the conception of what's happening in the world to a very constricted framework. And he expresses real disappointment, actually, with technologies like GPT. He finds them to have almost no intellectual interest in the human sense. Because while they can mimic language patterns, they lack genuine understanding or critical thought. He sees them mainly as a potential tremendous tool of defamation and distortion.
It's a real paradox, isn't it? The internet could be this amazing tool for education, for enlightenment, but often consumers are just getting a very small part, a curated, simplified, maybe biased slice, leading to uninformed people making irrational choices. So what's the way out? Are we just trapped in these systems?
Well, Chomsky is actually, despite his critiques, quite hopeful in a way. He believes that while these control systems are powerful, they can be resisted and should be. He talks about the power of popular movements, people organizing to compel manufacturers to build privacy protections into technology, for instance, or developing alternative platforms altogether that aren't based on surveillance or manipulation. It comes back to collective action, really.
Okay, so that brings us to the crucial question, the call to action, maybe. What do we do with all this understanding? Chomsky makes this really interesting distinction between talking truth to power and talking to the powerless. What does he mean by that?
His point is, the people in power, say, the CEO of ExxonMobil, they already know the truth about things like fossil fuels and climate change. They've known for decades, according to internal documents. So telling them the truth is pointless. They already know it and ignore it. The real work is talking to the powerless, helping ordinary people understand how these systems work, helping them think for themselves. And he's careful to say, we don't own the truth. We do our best. But the goal is empowering others to question, to analyze.
You see that in his own life story, right? His activism against the Vietnam War, he wasn't just writing articles, he was actively challenging the official story. The idea that the U.S. went in there with the best of intentions.
Yeah.
He talks about speaking in somebody's living room or maybe in a church with a couple of people, just starting small, realizing you can't just stop.
Exactly. And he connects that kind of grassroots work to the huge societal shifts we've seen since the 1960s. Things like advances in women's rights, civil rights.
Yeah.
These enormous changes didn't just happen magically. They were driven by popular activism in the streets and organizing, often with students, young people in the forefront. That's where real change comes from, in his view.
So thinking about today, what are the common goals we should be rallying around? Where should that energy be focused? Chomsky consistently points to the institutional structures which are directed to profit and power for the few, and things like the decline of unions, which he sees as isolating people, making it harder to organize and push back collectively.
And then there's the issue he identifies as the most urgent, the most all-encompassing threat.
Yeah.
The climate crisis. He states bluntly that it's leading to the point where organized human life on Earth is severely endangered. The details in our sources are just staggering. Projections like 36 U.S. states facing water shortages,
Right.
or the Eastern Mediterranean potentially seeing a 5 degrees Celsius temperature rise and 2 to 2.5 meters, that's nearly 10 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. That would inundate vast settled areas.
It's overwhelming. It's easy to feel completely hopeless when you hear things like that, right? The average person might feel like, what can I possibly do? These problems are just too big.
They're huge problems. But Chomsky, even now, remains incredibly motivated. He insists that for any serious problem we face, there are feasible answers. The solutions often exist. The real challenge, he says, is finding the will, the dedication to move on to a much better world. It's about political will and collective action, not a lack of technical solutions, and he puts great faith in the power of ordinary people, countless unknown people whose actions lay the basis for which great events later happen." End quote. He gives this beautiful example of very poor communities in southern Colombia, endangered communities, working very hard to organize to protect virgin forests. End quote. Those are the people, he says, who deserve our honor and respect, often more than the famous names.
And he definitely sees young people as crucial to this. He mentions the Sunrise Movement in the United States, global student strike, and Greta Thunberg standing up at Davos and telling the global elite, you have betrayed us. That really resonates with his view.
Absolutely. He's very clear that powerful interests like fossil fuel corporations will keep doing what they do, pursuing profit, as long as they can get away with it. Change won't come from them willingly. But we know what has to be done. The truth, the path forward, is going to have to be worked out by people in their own activist struggles. It has to come from the ground up.
So wrapping up this deep dive on Noam Chomsky, it really leaves you with a much clearer picture of how power works, how information gets filtered, and maybe most importantly, how we can actually push back. His work, whether it's dissecting language or media, it always seems to circle back to this fundamental human capacity we have for critical thought.
Yeah, his whole journey, from that moment, seeing the reaction to Hiroshima, to challenging dominant linguistic theories, to analyzing media manipulation, it all highlights that confronting uncomfortable truths, questioning the status quo. It's not just some academic game. He sees it as a vital civic duty. It's about empowering ourselves, empowering others to see beyond the manufactured consent.
So maybe the takeaway for you, listening, is this. As you go through your day, scrolling through feeds, reading headlines, even just having conversations, pause for a second. Ask yourself, what filters might be at play here? What perspectives might be missing? And maybe think about how you in your own sphere can contribute, even in small ways, to that bigger struggle for a more informed, more critical, and ultimately a more just world.